As the evening sun cast long shadows over the streets of Sacramento, the city hummed with the sounds of life winding down. Golden hues painted the skyline, blending seamlessly with the amber glow of streetlights flickering on in the early dusk. Among the steady stream of cars making their way home, Eric Porter sat behind the wheel of his sedan, his fingers tapping absently against the steering wheel as the soft hum of the engine accompanied him. A long day at the office had left him eager to get home, to shed the weight of the day's demands and ease into a quiet evening. The air conditioning purred softly, a welcome relief from the residual heat of the day. The radio played a mellow tune in the background, a subtle contrast to the vibrant pulse of the city outside. As he approached an intersection, the traffic light flickered from green to yellow, prompting him to ease his foot onto the brake. He watched as the light turned red just as he came to a complete stop, a moment of stillness amidst the ever-moving current of city life. Then suddenly the piercing flash of blue and red lights filled his rearview mirror, followed by the sharp wail of a police siren. His brows furrowed slightly, the calm of his evening commute disrupted in an instant. With a practiced ease, he signaled and guided his car to the side of the road, rolling down his window as the police cruiser pulled up behind him. A few moments later, the sound of boots striking pavement reached his ears. Officer Bradley Larson, a man in his mid-30s with a buzz cut and a badge gleaming on his chest, adjusted his belt as he approached the driver's side. His gait exuded confidence, the kind that came from years of enforcing the law and expecting compliance. "License and registration," Larson stated, his tone clipped and authoritative. Eric complied without hesitation, reaching into his glove compartment to retrieve the documents. As he handed them over, he noted the way Larson's eyes lingered on him, scrutinizing every move he made. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Larson asked, leaning slightly toward the window. Eric met his gaze, his expression neutral. "I'm not entirely sure, officer." "You didn't come to a full stop at the light," Larson replied, though there was a brief flicker of hesitation in his voice. Eric nodded thoughtfully. "I see. I thought I slowed down in time, but I understand." Larson didn't immediately respond. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them, his gaze narrowing slightly as he continued to assess the man before him. What should have been a routine stop had suddenly become something more, at least in Larson's eyes. He glanced down at the license in his hand, frowning. "You're not from around here, are you?" Eric hesitated for just a moment before answering. "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." But Larson didn't seem interested in the details. His line of questioning took on an edge, a subtle shift that suggested he was no longer concerned with just a traffic violation. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" Eric's expression remained steady. "Just going home." Larson studied him, searching for something beneath the calm facade. The longer the exchange continued, the more it became clear. This wasn't about a traffic stop anymore. The tension between them thickened. Eric could sense it, feel the weight of unspoken assumptions pressing down on the interaction. He remained still, controlled, unyielding. "Step out of the car for me," Larson finally ordered. Eric's fingers tightened slightly around the steering wheel before he released a slow breath. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" Larson's lips twitched, but he masked it quickly. "I asked you to step out of the car. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." The unspoken threat lingered between them. After a brief pause, Eric unfastened his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out with measured movements. Larson's eyes flicked over him, taking in the tailored suit, the polished shoes, details that suggested success, precision, control. But none of that seemed to matter in this moment. "Hands where I can see them," Larson instructed. Eric complied, his movements deliberate. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" Larson smirked faintly. "Just routine. We've had some incidents around here. Can never be too careful." Eric tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans, or does this have more to do with something else?" The question landed with weight, and for a brief second, Larson's composure faltered. He straightened, his hand instinctively drifting toward his belt. "Watch your tone," he said, voice hardening. "I'm simply asking a question," Eric replied, his voice measured but firm. Larson leaned in, his eyes narrowing. You seem awfully familiar with how this works. You got something to hide. Eric let the silence settle before speaking. No, officer, I just believe in being clear about the reasons for an interaction like this. Transparency, you know. Larson scoffed but didn't reply. Instead, he paced a small circle, frustration evident in the set of his jaw. This wasn't playing out the way he had expected. Eric wasn't flustered, wasn't stammering, wasn't showing fear. Instead, there was something else, an unsettling calm that put Larson on edge. You seem pretty confident, Larson muttered, almost to himself. Like you think you know what's going to happen next. Eric didn't react. Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is. For a brief second, Larson froze. The smugness in his expression flickered, replaced by something sharper, almost defensive. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. The silence stretched between them, the air heavy with unspoken tension. And in that moment, Larson began to realize this wasn't going to end the way he had anticipated. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. The real test was about to begin. He tapped his fingers against the holster on his belt, irritation flickering in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Eric. His gaze darted back to the sedan as if searching for something, some justification for what he hadn't yet found. Turn around and place your hands on the hood, he ordered, his voice clipped. Eric raised an eyebrow. Weapons, he repeated, his tone incredulous but controlled. The next few moments would decide everything. And neither man was ready to yield. Eric's movements were unhurried, calculated. He kept his voice even, measured. I'm reaching for my badge, he said, his tone devoid of tension, yet firm enough to cut through the silence between them. His eyes remained locked on Larson's, watching the officer's fingers twitch near his holster, the reflex of a man conditioned to see threats where there were none. No need for theatrics, Eric continued, slow and deliberate. I want you to see it. The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken weight. Larson's gaze followed Eric's hand as he smoothly pulled a leather wallet from his pocket, flipping it open with an almost casual ease. The badge inside caught the fading light, gleaming, unmistakable. Eric Porter, he said, as if introducing himself at a neighbor's barbecue. He let the silence stretch for a moment, then added, Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division. Larson's entire body stiffened. His eyes flickered between the badge and Eric's face, his mind scrambling to reconcile the man he had pulled over with the authority standing before him. The color drained from his face, and for the first time, the cocky confidence that had laced his tone earlier began to crumble. Internal Affairs, he repeated, the words barely above a whisper. Yes, Eric interjected before Larson could stumble through the rest of his thought. I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that those wearing this badge uphold the integrity and values it represents. Larson swallowed hard, his throat working against the weight of the moment. The reality of the situation hit him in waves. The power dynamic had shifted in an instant. Eric took a step forward, subtly reclaiming the space Larson had unconsciously retreated from. Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Larson? His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath the words, honed like a blade. Larson didn't answer. He looked like a man who had just realized he had stepped into quicksand and was only now feeling himself sink. It's not the profiling, Eric continued, shaking his head slightly. Though that's bad enough, it's not even the baseless escalation. It's that you did all of this without even realizing who you were talking to. The words landed heavily. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights. That I wouldn't understand the laws you swore to uphold. And why is that, Officer Larson? Larson opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Eric didn't let him off the hook. His gaze bore into the officer, unrelenting. Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect, he finished. The words weren't angry, but they carried the weight of an indictment. Larson exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging as the full impact of Eric's words settled over him. His fingers twitched at his side, his posture deflating. And that's not just a problem for me, Officer, Eric pressed, voice unwavering. That's a problem for everyone you encounter in uniform. Silence wrapped around them like a vice. Eric allowed the moment to stretch, then took a calculated step back. Here's what's going to happen, he said. You're going to take a step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next. Larson hesitated, the war inside him evident in the flicker of emotions across his face. He was debating whether to push back, whether to salvage his authority, but the moment was already lost. Eric watched him closely. "You're going to hear from me again, Officer Larson," he added, lowering his voice. "Not as a driver on the side of the road, but as the man tasked with deciding whether you're fit to wear that badge." A long breath left Larson, and with it, whatever shred of bravado he had been clinging to. His hand moved to his chest pocket, fingers fumbling slightly as he retrieved Eric's license and registration. He extended them, his grip just barely steady. Eric took them without a word, sliding them back into his wallet. He turned toward his car, his hand resting on the door handle. Then, with deliberate precision, he looked over his shoulder. "Remember this, Officer Larson," he said. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." Eric slid into his car and started the engine, the rumble breaking the silence that had settled between them. As he pulled away, Larson remained where he stood, confidence shattered, future uncertain. For Eric, though, this wasn't over. Not even close. The drive home was quiet, but his mind wasn't. The encounter replayed itself, not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. Larson wasn't the first officer Eric had encountered like this, and he knew he wouldn't be the last. But this time, things would be different. This time, he had the power to act. The next morning, Eric sat at his desk, early sunlight filtering through the blinds. In front of him lay an open file, Officer Bradley Larson. His record wasn't spotless. Minor complaints, unprofessional conduct, patterns of behavior that had never been properly addressed. Eric leaned back, fingers steepled. Larson wasn't an isolated case. He was a symptom of something much bigger. And Eric wasn't interested in putting a bandage on a bullet wound. A knock at his door. Linda, his assistant, stepped in, a stack of reports in her hands. "Morning, Mr. Porter. I've got the summary on last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Daniels wanted me to remind you about the department review next week." Eric nodded, taking the files. "Thanks, Linda. Schedule a meeting with Daniels for this afternoon. There's something I need to discuss." Linda hesitated, picking up on the gravity in his voice. "Of course," she said before stepping out. Eric turned his focus back to Larson's file. But this wasn't just about one officer. It was about the culture that allowed men like him to believe their behavior was acceptable. Later that afternoon, Eric sat across from Chief Daniels, a seasoned veteran whose graying hair and tired eyes told the story of decades in law enforcement. Daniels listened intently as Eric recounted the traffic stop. "I could have written it off as another bad interaction," Eric said. "But that would have been a mistake. Larson's behavior isn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of how much work we still have to do." Daniels exhaled slowly. "This isn't the first time Larson's name has come up," he admitted. Eric held his gaze. "And that's the problem. We can't keep handling this quietly. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Daniels nodded slowly. "Then let's fix it." As the dust settled, the truth finally emerged. The last piece of the puzzle clicked into place, revealing a betrayal deeper than anyone could have imagined. With a heavy heart, they faced the reality of their actions, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. In the end, justice was served, not in the way they expected, but in a way that ensured no one else would suffer the same fate. As they walked away from the chaos, a sense of closure settled over them, though the scars of the past would always remain. The world moved on, but the legend of that fateful night would be whispered in hushed tones for generations to come. And as the sun set on the horizon, they knew that some secrets were meant to stay buried forever.